Welcome back to the Church of Doom, everybody. Today I am beginning a series in which I'm going to read the entire 2024 version of the Dungeon Master's Guide. I've already started, I'm into chapter 2, and I've been editing things, I've been highlighting things, I've left little notes in there to talk about, and I'm going to pass along every piece of feedback and advice and experience that I possibly can to you as we work through this. And in this video, we're just doing chapter 1, and this video is like an hour long, so this is quite literally a mega deep dive. So subscribe if you haven't so that you can catch all the future parts and chapters of this DMG, and let us pray. I'm very sorry, I have to make a quick caveat here first to point out, look how cool the new Black Dragon design is. Skeletal face from all the acid they breathe. Big, wide, curled horns, almost like a bull or a goat, which is very demonic looking, I like that. And her spinal cord is showing. This is the coolest. I love this artwork, and I'm saying this as a caveat because I need to point out that I do not like a lot of the rest of the art in this book. That's going to be a common critique of mine. You're going to have to just kind of deal with that. Let me bitch about the art sometimes. But otherwise, I love this hobby. I love everything about it, and I cannot wait to tell you more. But just, yeah, heads up. The basics. Dungeons & Dragons is a game in which you take on roles as the players and tell a communal story. I think they do a good job of summarizing that and putting it right up front. This is what the game is all about. I think that's really cool, and I think that's very accurate. Now, they go on to explain what does the DM do, and it's got actor, director, improviser, referee, storyteller, teacher, world builder, right? I crossed out director because, I thought it was a little repetitive with storyteller. That's why I have that kind of asterisk there. I feel like those are sort of the same thing. And if I had to pick between the two, I would tell you to be a storyteller as opposed to a director, because when I think of a director, I think of...
I understand you're trying. You're maybe trying too hard or you're not trying hard enough. I don't know what the fucking problem is. All right. Well, let's go. It's fucking 5 lines, man.
I think of someone running around a set, telling the actors what to do, telling them, like, I want more of this. I want to see more of this. Can you give me... Come on, give me more emotion, which I guess that's fine. Like, if you want to get more emotion out of your players, do that. But I didn't like that they used that word. I feel like it implies a lot of control over how the players act. And speaking of player actions, they talk about, as the improviser, you are responsible for imagining the consequences of your players' actions, right? And that's good, but I would add on to that, it's not just consequences, because when I hear that, I think of negative things.
What will you learn? What will you learn? That your actions have consequences!
Usually what jumps to mind with consequence. You could also think of it as dramatic outcomes. Whenever your players do something, whenever they roll a dice or attempt a check, it is up to you to make the outcome of that action feel cool or have some sort of real impact. In my opinion, the worst thing you can do as a game master is make the players feel like their actions are just kind of just meh. Like, okay, you did it, off to the next person. Like, if there's no weight, there's no dramatic tone to what they're trying to do, be it good or bad, it's just like, what are we doing, right? It just kind of all feels pointless. So this is very, very important. Equally important is your role as the referee. You're the one who decides when and how the rules are applied, just like it says, and that is good advice. But I know, at least when I was starting out, that kind of still feels a little nebulous. Like, okay, but like,
what does a bean mean?
Someone please explain it to Kevin.
What does this mean? Like, when and how to apply the rules? Well, I don't even know when to do that, right? So help me out here. This is my kind of gut instinct on or maybe the rule I the rule I use to apply the rules is I apply rules to make the most dramatic outcome. I don't apply if a rule tells me how something should happen, but that outcome would be boring or go against kind of the narrative we're trying to tell here, or it just feels like, I mean, I guess that's what would happen, but feels weird, then I just change the rule. But if the rule says something should happen and that makes sense and it's dramatic, then I stick with it. So that's my guideline for being the referee. They know here that it's your job to teach players the rules of the game, obviously. I would also add on to that it is your job to teach players what the spirit and the vibe of this game is all about. If your only job is to teach them how to play the game, but you don't kind of I even made this note, you don't set the example of, yeah, this game has rules, but it's also more about just having fun and rule of cool and getting into, getting very excited about what we're doing here and enjoying this as a hobby. This shouldn't be an obligation. You guys should be coming here and everybody's pumped to be here. That is also part of teaching your players what this game is about. They are not mind readers. if you as the dungeon master have an idea in your head of what you want this game to be, but you're not expressing that to the players or setting an example of what that would look like, then you can't get frustrated with your players when it doesn't go the way you want it to go, right? So take this seriously. You are a teacher. And for world building, that is a bottomless rabbit hole that I have no tangible, real good advice to give you, and I think anybody on this platform would agree that you kind of just wing that part of it. You just kind of figure out for yourself what you like. I guess I could warn you against jumping into every tool you see for world building, right? Like, I'm not trying to throw them under the bus here, but like something like World Anvil can look really cool, and you might love using it. And World Anvil is just like a site where you can basically create a wiki for your world. That's really cool. Like, and if you want to get that into it, go for it. But that is not the expectation, nor is that the norm, I would say. I would guess that the norm when it comes to world building is literally just every session you are live with your players in your head, building this world kind of one track at a time in front of them to the best of your ability. And that is totally fine. That's how I like to do it. Then they hit you with a couple DM tips to help you focus on fun, which is the priority of the game. They know it. So things like embrace the shared story, right? You might know point A and point Z of the story you want to tell, but B through Y, right? All the other things that happen should be mostly up to your players. And it's up to you to just make that all feel really cool. Then they say it's not a competition. Oh boy, that is such a piece of information that I wish I had heard earlier on, especially when it comes to combat. Your job is not to kill the players.
We will kill them all.
And you're also not like mustering your force to go to war with your players. You are putting a fun obstacle in front of them and then trying to move those pieces on the board to the best of your ability to keep the drama going. Be fair and flexible. I think the easiest way to kind of hit this one home is if your justification for something in the game, or if you ever use the line, because I'm the DM, or because, I'm the DM, I said so, that's why. This is not the hobby for you. You should go find something else because, 9 times out of 10, I rule on my player's side, and more so. I want them to get what they want, and I want to make it even cooler. Because if I do that, they're going to want to keep coming back and doing more cool things with me in these stories, right? Communication with your player. That's a great one. They're not mind readers. I already noted that. So having these open channels of communication, of being able to express yourself and say like, hey, I feel like maybe our actions are not having a lot of impact on the game. Can we maybe work on that a little bit? That's important. That's an important conversation to be able to have. I guess that's a player talking to the DM, but you need to be receptive to those conversations too. That's a big part of this. And then it's okay to make mistakes. I'm going to reiterate that 1,000 times. On to the things that you need. Rule books. As always, the player handbook is the most important one. If you're going to be a player in D&D, I would say you don't have to buy this book. You and another player, or even 3 of you, could just pool your money together, get one, and then take pictures of your classes and send those back and forth, and so you can kind of study outside of the session. But then when you show up, you're all sharing the one book. I think that's totally fine. As the Dungeon Master, I think I would buy all of them. I think it's just fun to have them. I will be curious, though, to see by the end of this review of the book if I do think that this version of the Dungeon Master's Guide is as crucial to have. I think it was pretty general consensus in the previous version of 5e. This is already getting annoying of it's 5e, but it was the previous version of 5e. Anyways, it was pretty much agreed upon that you didn't need the DMG. It was fine to have, but it didn't really do much. So anyways, let's move on to the next one. They say you need a Dungeon Master and players, go figure. They also give some pretty common advice of where to find a group. I think that some of these can work. If you have a group of friends in person that wants to play, you have been blessed by the D&D gods. That's awesome. Stick with it. I will add in here, though, that if you don't, you should check out startplaying.games. That is a website that is run by a friend of mine, Devin. I've plugged this site. I have used it. I ran a year-long Curse of Strahd campaign on here, and it's a site where dungeon masters from all over the world run paid sessions for all kinds of systems. It's not just D&D. So if you want to go play Pathfinder or Morkborg or something like that, you can find a game on that site. It is pay to play for the most part. But you're paying typically $10 to $20 in the case of my sessions on there for 2 to 3 to 4 hours of really well prepped D&D, and everybody else is taking it very seriously because they're also paying to be there. So go check that out too. Their next section is a place to play. They kind of go to a weird amount of detail to just say, like, find a private room to play a game in. It's not that weird, but I guess for some people maybe it's brand new. But they also say here, like, you might want to have some background music. Well, actually what they're saying is some people might not like that you have background music. I'm gonna take a really firm stance against that. I have played D&D without music, and it is really, really awkward. For me, at least. It's like very, very bizarre to be trying to get immersed into this world, but you can just kind of, like, if there's ever an awkward pause, it's an awkward pause. At least when you've got background music, there's something always there to make everybody at the table feel comfortable not talking. Which I really like. And at the same time, if you're finding cool playlists or video game albums or whatever for the combat music and stuff, it just feels like so badass when you have a good track in combat. Of course, you're going to need dice to run the game. If you're I would say a good DM, then you will have a small bowl of dice for the players to choose from when they show up for their first session. It can be really embarrassing and weird for a player to show up and be like, all right, does everybody have their dice? Like, I didn't know I needed to buy dice. And you're like, well, I'll let you borrow one of mine this time, but make sure you get your dice for next. Like, that's weird. Don't do that. Don't make them feel bad for not buying something for this game that you invited them to come play, right? I actually have, it's like in a little candy bowl on my game table out there, and it's just got a couple sets in there that anybody can choose from anytime they come over. I think that's a good way to go about it. If you are wanting to get your own set of dice, though, I made a note so I wouldn't forget to mention, I am affiliated with Only Crits. They make really, really good sharp edge dice. They're going to be making the Church of Doom official dice at some point in the future when I get around to it. But if you use the code DOOM, DOOM, all caps, then you can get 10% off your first set of polyhedrals, which is cool. Now, note-taking is a whole giant can of worms. It's another sort of rabbit hole. Some people get crazy into their note-taking, and they're super detailed and very templatized. They have like a Notion document that they do it all in. For me, I guess, especially as a player, my notes are just on the back of my character sheet. It's one page. It's like a name when we meet an NPC or something like that. I'll jot it down, and then I don't have to remember to bring my notebook. I've got ADHD, so I am always forgetting those types of things. So I just stick with the one sheet. Another little plug or not plug, but some advice for you for note taking is Sly Flourish, the Lazy Dungeon Master. If you haven't checked him out and his books and his videos on YouTube, definitely do so. He's got really, really great advice for prepping a session and how to organize that prep. And how to use a digital tool like Notion, but all of his advice could also apply to physical note taking. So definitely go check him out because I am not as qualified to give advice. I will note though here that something cool that DMG is doing this time around is providing some templates or a form of a campaign journal through these kind of worksheet sort of things that they've included in the book for you to run your campaigns with and organize. And I really like that idea. Years and years ago when I first started my RPG channel, that was kind of something I tried to do, was create useful templates to build things. So I love that it's here in the DMG now. We'll talk about the templates as they kind of pop up throughout the reading and the book and stuff. I think they're a great idea. So definitely use those, but I've got some issues with them that we'll talk about when we get there. For useful additions, they note a DM screen, a battle grid or map and miniatures, and then card accessories. So for the DM screen, I have not used a DM screen for many years. I tend to roll out in the open as often as I can. As often as I can. I always roll out in the open. But this little note here of like some GMs will have their screen set up to the side to use just for their miniatures and stuff. Just had me think like, oh yeah, why didn't I ever think of that? Like, I could set up a little mini screen that has some rules reference, and also I could do my random table rolls behind that to add some dramatic effect to those rolls, I guess, if I wanted to. So that was an interesting addition. I'll have to maybe try that out. Battle grid and miniatures. It's a slippery slope, you know. You can really rack up some serious credit card bills with all those things you can buy. But a few I would suggest would be Chapeku for your maps and Knucklebone Minis if you've got a 3D printer. Those are two just really awesome accounts on Patreon that put out really good stuff. Okay, and now card accessories is their last sort of useful addition they mentioned, and I think cards are even more valuable than the battle grid and the miniatures. Ever since I bought and read Index Card RPG from Runehammer, it was just what changed my entire perspective of the game and really, I think, is what made me fall in love with the hobby. I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons since 5th edition first came out, but it was index card RPG that really opened my eyes and my mind up to just how flexible you can get with your prep and your gameplay and the way that you map things and stuff. I'll link a few videos where I've kind of started showing off how I've been making index card dungeons and things like that. But seriously, go buy Index Card RPG from Runehammer. I'll link it down below, and just fall in love with it the way that I did, because Hank is just our messiah when it comes to RPGs. We have now reached the first big major page of critiques and straight up just issues I have with this Dungeon Master's Guide, preparing a session. Now, they had me in the first half here where they're talking about the 1 hour guideline. I really like this little section here. It basically gives you a new expectation of how much gameplay you can get through in an hour of playing. And they say a group can typically do 3 of these things in 1 hour. Looking over this list, I completely agree. I think that's a reasonable expectation. It aligns with what I experience at my table, and it's much better advice than they gave in the previous DMG, which was like, in 1 day of in-world time, your group will get through 6 adventuring encounters. It was kind of like, oh, okay, that's a weird thing to try and imagine. Like, it's in-world time and their level of abilities and how many resources they have access to. Gosh, I have to try and track all of that. No one ever really did, and everybody agreed that was bad advice. But this is good advice. Now the bad advice. In the preparation time section, Wizards of the Coast just does a bad job of copying the lazy Dungeon Master's Guide to session prep. They try and condense the list of things you need to do down, but don't even do a very good job describing what each of these steps are, and also just have this unrealistic expectation of what you can get done in an hour. And in the 1 hour prep, it's like, all right, just prep everything, including getting all of your maps and things like that. It's like, okay, I guess I'll try, but this is not a lot of advice to go off of. That's why you should go get the Lazy Dungeon Master's Guide. And then in the 2 hour prep, it's almost insulting. They're like, and if you've got another hour, maybe look, design some more stuff, prep some more things for the possible encounters, and I guess make some maps and some minis. It's like, what? Oh, how is this helpful? And then also, if you've got a 3rd hour to work with, go over your unlikely encounters and design some custom encounters for some of the characters. It's just ridiculous. Don't listen to this. Good news, though, we're back to some stuff that I do agree with. So, how to run a session. They start with a recap. That's great. I like that they suggest having maybe players recap it, because you can gauge what the players think is interesting. I would encourage you to do that version. I think it is very, very useful. And it also, I think, just helps get players invested, or in the mindset of being invested in the story before you've even started playing. By asking them to give you the recap, they all start to get excited, remembering the things that happened last week, and they're hyping each other up about it, and then they get to start playing. Whereas when I give a recap, I find it feels more like I'm lecturing them, or giving this kind of boring little talk that people are still they're not even really listening, and not that I can blame them, but they're getting their dice set up, they're opening up their book and things like that. And I notice that doesn't happen as often with a player recap. Once you're done with your recap, you're jumping into your encounters, right? You're running a session. Something I would have liked to have seen included in their kind of description of what an encounter is and how it builds out a session is that often it is useful, and you've heard this advice probably before, of start with something exciting.
You're gonna tell me where the rabbit's foot is, or she dies.
Don't just start a session kind of flat after a recap. Get your players going with something that can allow them to make meaningful decisions and start impacting the story right out of the gate. It doesn't always have to be a combat, but just something cool for them to do. And I also want to say, for encounters, they talk about how in step 1, you describe the situation, you give them all the information they need. That is almost understated with how important it is that you are responsible for giving your players these spoken clues, right? You have to describe things in a way that gets them to want to investigate it and learn more. Doing a super long, incredibly detailed description of every aspect of a room does not make me or your players want to go investigate things, because A, they're going to just lose interest and kind of just want to skip to the next room to hopefully do something more interesting. And B, if you describe everything, or if you make it feel like you've described this room in so much detail that the players are almost feeling like they couldn't, what is there to have missed? Does that make sense? if you over-describe it, you leave no room for mystery, for curiosity. So keep that in mind when you're trying to describe things. And also, on the topic of describing things, I just X'd out the note that they have of like some published adventures have read aloud text. Don't use read aloud text. I get it's one thing to have like a little bit of a written note of like, this is what I want to sort of say at this core moment. But a block of read aloud text is just weird to read in a session, and it's just awkward. Don't do it. Watching that back, because like I said, don't use read aloud text, but then it's okay to have a note of like, I want to say this thing at this point. That what I mean is, in your notes, you should have a bulleted list of like, these are some of the core pieces of information, be they secrets, clues, backstory, any of that kind of stuff, magic items, that kind of stuff. It's okay to have almost like a checklist to make sure that you at some point get that information across. But what I don't like about read aloud text is that it sort of sets this, it implies that you need to get it right the first time. It's like, when get everybody quiet and then read them this read aloud text, and that's okay. And then you can step back and you're done and you did your description. And I just think that's just not how it works. And that's not how it goes. You do a quick description of kind of the major points, and then you keep giving more description as your players ask more questions, and you realize, oops, I forgot to describe this, so you sneak it in a description later on. That's how it works. This brings us to the easiest part of being a dungeon master, letting the players talk. This is when you get to sit back and watch them.
I have my opinion. I'm just curious.
Well, what's your opinion?
Yeah, what is it?
Someone was interrogated.
That's way better than mine. Never mind.
What was yours?
I was just thinking that, like, maybe there was an invisible person tied to the chair.
Yeah, that's way worse. Yeah, yours is much better.
Or come up with their plan of how they're going to attack the ogres in the cave, and all that fun stuff is, and I mean that literally, like, that is so fun. If you don't like that, then I don't know, that's a red flag to me. Like, if you don't like being able to watch your players play the game, then you're kind of just playing for yourself, right? So do a little reflecting on that. But let the players talk is a great piece of advice. And I also made a little note here of intention. When you ask the players what they want to do, you're not just asking them literally like, what does your character do? I mean, you are doing that, but more importantly, you as the dungeon master need to make sure you understand what is this player trying to accomplish with the action, not just the action itself. I'm not going to get too into the details of what I mean by that, just because I know we're going to talk about this in future sections of this book. So for the sake of brevity, I want to also touch on this note here where they say, like, you want to make sure you give each player time in the spotlight. But right before that, they say, you don't have to do initiative order. Initiative order is kind of only for combat. I might be in the minority here, but I got this advice from Runehammer, and I've been doing it forever since I heard it, and I just think it's great advice. I always play in initiative order, even when we're outside of combat, because A, it ensures everybody does get their moment in the spotlight, and B, it's what kind of helps make it feel like a structured game, especially with adults. Like when we're all together and we're taking time out of our valuable days, it's important that everybody leaves feeling like they actually did something, and initiative order ensures that happens. Now we're going on to describing what happens. You've asked the players, or you've kind of been going in an initiative order, what do you do on your turn? What do you do on your turn? And now you need to figure out what is the outcome. And I'm not going to get lost, go through every single one of these, because it's kind of just restating the rules of the game, right? Like, they need to typically make an ability check, and you have them roll a dice, and blah, 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 blah. What I care more about is right here in the role-playing, where they mention that NPCs can be like, or monsters, I guess, too, can be friendly, indifferent, or hostile. That is something that wasn't very heavily emphasized in the previous DMG. I think it was in there, but it was like an optional rule. And now it's a lot more front and center. I've seen it talked about a lot more, and I like this a lot. Or I guess I should say, I want to try this because it actually seems very helpful. I have not been doing this, and now I'm realizing, like, it's no wonder oftentimes when role-playing encounters happen, they feel a little kind of lost in the breeze.
Find a waiter and introduce myself. Why is he a pirate?
He's a gnome. He only speaks gnome.
Anybody here speak gnome?
Oh, I do. Lavernica does.
Well, this will be painless.
Because you don't know exactly what the character's motivations are yet, or the NPCs are, right? So this helps. We're going to skip down past some of this basic rule stuff and get to what I think is one of the most critical, enjoyable coolest parts about this hobby, about being a dungeon master, which is when narrating results, try to give a flavorful description while clearly communicating what's happening, right? And I just made a little note that says, make the hero epic. That if I had to put my DMing style into like a one sentence thesis, it would be, I make the players feel like badass heroes. That's all I care about. Every spell, every persuasion check, every attempt to hide, even everything the characters do, I put my heart and soul into making that description feel as cool as possible. And what I think cool means is vivid. Vivid, and it matches the player's expectations of what they want their character to be like, right? If I had a wizard whose whole deal was they wanted to be fire themed, then when that character casts Fireball, it's not just you throw a ball of fire across the room and it explodes, roll your dice, cool, okay, you do 24 damage, right? It's this wizard lifts their hand slowly, and as they do so, everyone in the room suddenly smells the stench of burning wood and ash. And with a single flick of this character's wrist, this spark appears on the far side of this room, this small, faint little spark that then in an instant grows and expands and erupts like a sun itself being born in this room. That's a much, much cooler description, right? That's cool. That's not just Fireball. That is that character's Fireball. Here we've come to a part of DMing that I've kind of sucked at for the longest time, which is the passage of time or moving things along, basically. They make really clear notes that I've highlighted here of like, you do not need to roleplay everything. You can skip, honestly, 95% of what would otherwise happen in the character's world as they're going about their adventures.
The group began to describe themselves walking. And as they described themselves walking, so did Obed confirm they walked.
And unless you have something really cool you want to have happen, or like something I'll do is typically if there's overland travel, I'll have like one cool encounter planned for along the way, but it's easy to avoid if the characters want to. Unless you're doing something maybe similar to that, yeah, just follow this advice. Just get the players to the next cool thing that they can engage with. The players are not going to have fun spending 2 to 3 sessions getting to the thing that they were really excited to do 2 months ago in the real world, right? Ending a session, another thing that I don't feel like I'm very good at, so I don't have a lot of advice to give here. I just highlighted this one section where it mentions ask your players things that they liked and didn't like, and I would not let your players get away with saying, no, it's all great. Like, push them. Push your friends. Like, get them to give you some real feedback, especially if you want to be as good of a dungeon master as you can possibly be. You're your own worst critic, but often you don't give yourself very actionable critiques to work off of, right? So I highlighted that. But then a piece of advice that I wanted, or a tip that I wanted to share that my friend does, is at the end of every session, he does an end credit scene. So, inspired just like from the Marvel movies, he will describe a cool scene that is happening somewhere in the world. It doesn't even have to be like with the characters. It could be somewhere else in the world. Like in the last session, he described a villain we thought we would never see again arriving on a deserted island and getting ready for their revenge plot. And we were like, what the? That is so cool. So try that out next time. Now we have reached another major critique of mine, their example of play. And this isn't unique to this DMG. This is frankly unique to every example of play I've ever seen published from Wizard of the Coast. They are so boring to read. It goes like their examples of play kind of, I feel like, go against everything that I just very passionately shared of like, make the players sound cool, make their actions matter, don't just skip, okay, you did your thing, on to the next player. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it here. Actually, I'm just going to get to the next page. Hang on. Clearly not a fan, right? All caps terrible. Jared, the DM here, kind of does a lot of the things I say not to do. I think he did a good job of getting the players to give sort of a summary of the past session, but then immediately, Jared gives actually a pretty cool description, I think, of this scene that the players are arriving at, and then asks, what do you want to do now? And this right here is a great example of why I always play an initiative, because Jared just throws out this very broad open question, what do you want to do, to a table of, I think, like 3 or so players, and because there's not any sort of turn order or any structure to how the players can kind of interact with each other on their turn, Russell is kind of forced to just be like, I guess we continue upstream? Like, I don't know, get us to the thing where we can interact with it. Whereas if it was turn-based, Russell's character might be like, well, I'm going to scout ahead and look for clues of what might be waiting for us. And then what does the next character do on their turn, right? More writings of a madman. And this might just be like old man yelling at the clouds kind of deal here, but bad, boring, lame. Seriously, pause this and read the stuff that they're saying though, and tell me it's not bad, boring, and lame. There's nothing interesting here. And for a game of Dungeons and Dragons, like, this is your opportunity to show off and really get players excited about what they're about to experience. And all I'm really seeing here is like basic and literally just reading the abilities as they're written in the rule book. Like, there's just nothing very unique here. And it might be a super nitpicky critique, but it doesn't feel like that to me. It just feels like this reads like what an AI would tell you D&D is. If you ask, like, write up an interaction between 4 players and the GM. Here you go. It's like, all right, boring. That's enough negative. Let's get back to some positives, right? Every DM is unique. This section is talking about kind of just styles of DMing. And here I highlighted, I thought you just might be interested to know, they give some options of like, are you hack and slash or are you immersive role playing? Are you all ages or are you mature themes? And I just thought I would share where I fall on each of these. So hack and slash or immersive role playing, I love both. I think I actually have a pretty good combination of both, but if I had to pick one, I like immersive role playing. I definitely fall into the group of players that could go an entire session without ever rolling a dice. Like, it's purely role play and have just as much fun as a combat. All ages or mature themes. I have the most violent, crazy combats I can conjure. I don't have like sex and stuff in my games. Is like, well, that's not true. I did hook up with a Medusa once, and my dad was the DM. So, I'm in mature themes, I guess. For serious or silly, I'm definitely in the serious department. I take this game probably way too seriously, but not to the degree of like, I'm not a neckbeard about it. I still want this game to be fun and be silly. There's plenty of silly moments, but I think if you're always prioritizing silliness, your campaign's just not going to have the legs to get you very far. It's just going to either lose people's interest because silliness is only entertaining for so long, but also you're not going to get very much buy-in. Whereas if you take it serious and you listen to your players and you design stories around their backstories and you put that kind of effort in and you just take it seriously, they're going to buy in with you. Pre-planned or improvised, I do have a great deal of planning when it comes to maps and my minis and things like that. Check out the Patreon. But I am definitely more of an improvised GM. I just love making stuff up. If you've been following me for a while, you know a lot of my prep just kind of looks like 1d4 or 1d6 lists of bulleted items of the cool monster or magic item or clue that might be found in that room. That's the extent of my prep. And I like having very loose, freeform prep because it does allow me to improvise. But when I say improvise, I'm not thinking of like improv comedy or being able to just off the, cuff make something super epic up. I can't do that all the time. But if I put myself in a position as an improvised DM where I don't have all of the answers pre-written, then that means I'm forcing myself to exercise my creative muscles. And it also means that I can respond to my players a lot easier. I'm not loyal to my prep. I'm loyal to my players and their ideas, and I work off of that. General or thematic, that was a very easy one. I'm general. I have no patience at all. I could not stick to a thematic campaign very easily. That Curse of Strahd campaign went for a year, and that was the last time I will ever do that. That was tough to like stick in a horror dread genre that long. And at one point, the players even all kind of were like, yeah, this sucks. Like, this is a mega bummer being in such a focused, dark thematic campaign for so long. So I like to be able to mix it up. And then morally ambiguous or heroes. I'm team heroes. I've made videos saying that I don't like evil characters. I think they're disruptive, even if you have the best intentions as the player and the DM and you come to the agreement. I just think inevitably they lead to situations that just suck the fun out of the room. So I love making my players feel like heroes. Now, the caveat here is it's very cool to see characters go from morally ambiguous to heroes, but I'm not interested in watching them fall from grace. Some other things that they encourage you to check out might be house rules or homebrew, right? Borrowing mechanics from other systems or making up your own mechanics to try and increase the fun at your table, right? I think that's a critical part of the hobby. And if you aren't doing that, if you aren't experimenting with things, which means risking having like an encounter fall flat or even a session not go the way you want it to, right? If you're not willing to risk that, you're not going to grow as a dungeon master and a storyteller. So do this a lot. Up here talks about atmosphere again, saying, music can be a really helpful thing, but then it also has this caveat again for like the third time of like, I'm going to talk more about this on the next page, so I'm going to just move on, but I have some strong opinions about this stuff. But delegation is something that I don't do. I just like to handle all that kind of stuff in my table, but I think it can be really good for people who might have like information overload or that kind of stuff. And then learning by observing, go watch a live stream. Everybody knows Critical Role. I spent like an hour last night trying to record my thoughts on this page and just kept sounding like a white dude yelling about SJW stuff. And that is not what the point I'm going to try and make here. But here's what I want to say about this page. I do not like it. I really, really am annoyed by it because it does two things. A, it treats me and talks to me like I'm a toddler. That's the note I made here, right? It's like we've got this goo goo gaga baby beholder image when the first illustration in the book was this badass black dragon. And so that's just weird. Like even if I was like 13 and I was just getting into D&D or something and I got handed this sheet, I'd be like, what the fuck is this game? Like, and especially now as like at almost 30, I look at this and just think, yeah, I don't want to fill whatever this is out. This feels ridiculous. And also, these potentially sensitive elements are not potentially sensitive elements. Things like spiders, snakes, demons, romance, mind control are core fantasy tropes. Like, this just happens in like every fantasy story. And I think it's doing you, the viewer, the player of this game, a disservice. Not even just a disservice. I'm getting ahead of myself into point two. But to treat these sorts of things like they are these super terrifying, crazy things that we need to be really careful to bring up in our game, I do not think is healthy. I think that is... okay, I'll transition to point two. What I think this does, the other big issue I have here, is it doesn't do what I think it's setting out to do. I understand the point here, and I agree with the point. The point is, we don't want anybody to be uncomfortable at our tables. We want everybody to have fun. We want everybody to feel safe, right? I agree with that. That's what I do. But this is not how you should go about it. This is not, in my opinion, a very normal, healthy way to do it. I think it's incredibly awkward and clumsy. And what do I mean by awkward and clumsy? I mean that if I went to my friend's house or even my friendly local game store and I sat down to play D&D and I was really excited and this is what I got handed first, I would have some alarm bells going off in my head, almost of like, what kind of community am I joining here when my first exposure to the game is this like consent form, basically? I don't know. As I'm saying this out loud, I worry that I just sound like a cranky guy who doesn't want people to get offended by things, but I don't want to be that. I hope I'm not coming across that way. I just feel like, it just kind of comes back to this note. I just feel like I'm being treated like a toddler. And if D&D wants to have this type of tone for maybe a younger audience or something like that, I say go for it. That's great. But I don't think it needs to be in your core handbook. I feel like you're almost stating that the Nightmare GM is the norm and you should prepare for it. We're going to move to the next page here so that I can reiterate to you all that I agree with this point. And not only do I agree with it, I think it is incredibly important just to the longevity of any sort of adventuring group. D&D is a game for everyone, and not only is it for everyone, it should be fun for everyone. If something would spoil your fun, then it shouldn't be in the game. I, of course, agree with that point. And I kind of like what they said right here a lot more than the expectation sheet. Everyone has a stake in helping to resolve the issue. Or another way of saying it is, everyone at the table has a stake and a responsibility to make this game fun. And that includes you, the player. If you know something would spoil the fun for you, then tell your DM, right? You don't need to wait for someone to have you check the spider box in your expectation sheet to make sure that you don't run into them. Just initiate that conversation and tell your GM, hey, just don't include those. Another part of this that I really agree with is the setting expectations. It goes back to what they said, that a dungeon master is a teacher, and I think you teach by example. That's the most effective way. Not by having your players read the rules are they going to learn how to be a good player and how to make everybody at the table have fun and how to play off of each other's energy and not hog the spotlight and frankly not make other players uncomfortable, especially when we get into things like interparty romance and stuff like that, right? You have to take that initiative as the dungeon master to be the one who shows how you can handle all of this kind of stuff in a story responsibly, respectfully, just like a normal fantasy storyteller, right? It's okay if you want to try and initiate a little crush in an RPG, but if somebody responds with like, I have a boyfriend, I don't really want to do that, don't be an asshole. Respect that and drop it and move on. It's fine. This doesn't have to derail a campaign, right? We can all forgive each other and have fun. They then, on the next page, note that some players might not want to discuss their limits or the things that might make them uncomfortable out loud or in person, or especially, I would add, in a group setting. You know, if I showed up to my friendly local game store and got handed that expectation sheet and the DM was kind of looking at me like, hey, let me know all the things that you don't want me to talk about because it will make you uncomfortable. On the one hand, I guess I'd be like, okay, thank you. But on the other hand, I'd also be like, I don't even know you. Like, there are certainly things that people have that make them uncomfortable that they don't want to talk about with anyone that's a stranger. And so I think it's more important to set sort of an expectation of when you show up to a table, it's more important to just be a kind human being and respectful than it is to throw down your sheet and fill out, all the things that the DM needs to be on a high alert for from the other players, right? It's unrealistic. But this, I like. This is realistic and will build healthier tables, I think. And here they talk about how you can kind of signal your limits in play, right? When someone does something or says something that makes you uncomfortable, how do you voice that? How do you kind of make the session fun and safe for everybody, right? It's an important thing. It is important. And they suggest maybe having an X card where someone can hold up this card, has a big red X on it, and it lets everybody know they're kind of uncomfortable with this. And then it says down here that like this shouldn't trigger a debate or any sort of discussion as to why they're uncomfortable, which I also agree with, but I still feel like these things, they work against each other. It's like, hey, in the middle of your group session, make sure to hold up your big red card with an X on it. But also, don't be nervous about doing that, and don't be worried about someone triggering a discussion or anything. I know for me at least, I would feel just as uncomfortable feeling like I'm bringing the session to a screeching halt, even though that's a bad way to phrase it, but that's how I would feel about it. And that would make me not use the card. So what do? I've been sitting here for several minutes trying to kind of come to a satisfying answer to that question. I don't know if I necessarily have one. I just don't think that what's been proposed here is the best solution. It's a solution. This can work, and I've seen it used in cons and lots of places like that. And frankly, I think this is a pretty good approach for a place like a con, where you have thousands of people all coming together. You've got so much going on. It's already overstimulating. It makes a lot of sense, I think, to me to do something closer to this. But I think when it just comes to, beer and pretzels D&D, where you're kind of just having your friends over and stuff like that, this is going to maybe sound stupid, but I feel like a better answer is we just, as people, need to start learning how to be friends again and how to build connections again. Maybe I'm projecting my own reclusiveness here and kind of the addiction to social media, but I think learning how to communicate can solve a lot of these problems. And speaking of learning how to communicate, the very next page does a good job of teaching and giving some advice on what to do when you have things like inter-party conflict, which I know when I was like in college, this was a much, much bigger problem than it is nowadays. Because in college, frankly, a lot of people at that age, even, especially me, didn't know how to communicate super well. So conflicts just came up a lot more often. So listen to this kind of advice. I think that's great. Respect for the players is something that's already kind of been talked about a lot earlier, but I really agree with what they say here, which is if someone, crosses a line or slips up, makes a mistake, right? A lot of times someone can cross the line accidentally. I would say most of the time that's probably how it ends up happening. Let them know, pull them aside, not right then in the moment. Doesn't have to be a belittling sort of thing, but just let them know they crossed a line. Just be a heads up about it. And if they don't respect that, then they're out. That's pretty straightforward, and I agree with that. No D&D table has room for jerks and assholes. In the tragic limits section, they talk about death and whether or not you want that in your group. I am definitely I'm pro death.
What are your last words?
With blood.
Like I think that the best D&D campaigns are the ones that have, you know, a sense of real danger, real stakes, and I think it is hard to get that without death being on the table for the characters, especially if you're trying to tell a heroic fantasy story. If you're just trying to do a campaign that's like, we're building a shop in the city and we're going on quests down into the sewers to get coin to build it, that actually sounds fun, then yeah, maybe you don't want to have to worry about dying. So I think it's more of like a tonal thing than it is comfortability with the topic of death. I think, you know, we're all dying at some point, so best enjoy the kind of stories you can tell that almost honor it. Treat it as a reverent thing that deserves our respect and make cool stories out of it. You don't have to hide from it. Don't run away from it. But then, boy, oh boy, we are right back to another terrible piece of advice. DM die rolling. They say some DMs like to have their dice rolls hidden. Some people like to have them visible. I think you can do either. I don't have a very firm stance on that either way. I don't think if you roll your dice behind a screen, you're always fudging. But what I do have a problem with is when Wizards of the Coast says, sometimes you might lie about your dice. Never let the players know when you fudge a dice roll. What the fuck, guys? Like, why are we telling our apparently super young audience that it's okay to manipulate things behind the screens to tell the story that you want to tell? And I don't buy the argument of like, sometimes it's okay to fudge a dice roll to spare a character. I mean, was it the result of their actions in the game that put them in a dangerous situation, right? Like, why are we pulling our punches? It's a totally different thing if you're just a jerk meat grinder DM. That's a whole different can of worms, but this is just bad advice. Thankfully, the next page goes on to give more good advice, though. They talk about overly cautious players, which is something I don't know if it doesn't really ring any bells that a lot of people have talked about this before, or I've seen a lot of videos about it, but this is a real problem at tables where players can get so fixated on the idea of traps and preserving their resources and hit points and things like that, that in their attempts to play the game and be safe about this, they don't play the game. They actually bring it to a screeching halt, and the game just kind of becomes this, not cat and mouse, it's just like an inchworm moving through this dungeon, and there's not really even a story that's able to be told with that, right? So they give some good advice here of maybe using something like a timer, which I really love that concept of a timer. I first heard of it from Index Card RPG, where you roll a d4 and in that many rounds, something terrible will happen. And they note, like, don't use it all the time, but I think it's a great tool that I use pretty dang often. My little note there, though, says, after they said, use this technique with caution as time pressure can increase players' anxiety. I said, your players aren't babies. If somebody can't handle having a d4 timer rolled out in front of them and they get really freaked out by having a sense of urgency, I don't know if this is maybe going to be a super fun experience for them, a game where you're fighting monsters all the time and things like that. But I agree that overusing this mechanic can have super detrimental effects to your campaign. My Curse of Strahd campaign suffered from that. I used timers in almost every encounter. I think you can do that, but it ended up just kind of draining my players. They were like, every encounter feels like life or death, and we're not really having opportunities to role play or kind of just relax and have fun. And there we go. Some open communication happened. I appreciated the feedback. I pulled back on some of that stuff and it was great. But the way they pitch it here makes it sound like you might never want to use it because you could freak somebody out. And it's like, okay, come on. And a great piece of advice that I'm just now kind of noting the value in it the second time through is telegraphing encounters, or basically like foreshadowing is another way to think of it, right? When the dragon flies by overhead, which is the example they give here, that telegraphs to the players, or it foreshadows to them of like, hey, there's a dragon fight coming up if you want there to be one, which I think is really, really fun because in the hobbies debate of railroading, I think the pendulum swung way too far into the side of like, players need ultimate agency and total say over everything that their character does and what happens in the world, when really it's like, can we maybe bring it back a little bit and recognize that telegraphing or laying out some rails for the players to follow can actually get them to the story. And because players aren't mind readers, they don't know how to kind of get to the interesting parts all of the time, and telegraphing helps them get there. So This is great. Really, really, really like that advice. Then here they talk about respecting the DM. Amen to that. Your DM takes a lot of time out of their life to prepare this stuff for you. And if you value what they do for you, if you appreciate it, if you think it's good, if you want it to keep happening, one of the easiest ways to make sure that happens is to bring snacks. I know that's kind of a jokey thing you hear a lot, like the players bring the snacks and the DM runs the game. But like, it's true. Like when my players show up and bring snacks, I take note. And the ones who don't, I also take note. And it does actually hurt my feelings sometimes when I feel like I'm really working hard to make this as fun as possible. And when players just show up with nothing in hand except their character sheet, it kind of can make me feel like I'm being taken for granted a little bit. Or it's like, you know, guys, if I didn't prep all this, like, there would be nothing here. There would be no experience to really be had. So the snacks just are a good show of good faith of like, yep, you're doing a good job. I'm happy to be here and I'm making an equal contribution. So I'm a big fan of bringing a snack. Then they're talking about player dice rolling or just dice etiquette. At my table, that means if a dice rolls off the table or if it's cocked, which means it's kind of hard to tell exactly what number it's showing because it's at an angle, just re-roll it. And also, don't roll and then pick up your dice and say what you got before anybody else sees it. That's obviously going to make it look like you're cheating, even if you're not. And then another big thing is don't roll until it's called for. It might just be a control thing as a DM, but it is very, very annoying when a player's like, I'm going to go investigate that investigation roll. It's like, well, sure, that is probably the check I was going to call for, but there might have been a trap that was going to spring between here and there, right? So it's not always just like, I'm annoyed that I didn't get to be the one who says this is the type of check. As a player, recognize there's a lot of other things going on behind the screen or behind the scenes that you just might not be privy to. And so a dice roll, just throwing it out there, can be pretty disruptive. So yeah, good advice there. The rules discussion section I really like because they propose this idea that maybe it was in the old one, but I didn't see it, where if a player really wants to basically get like anal about the rules, it's like, no, I need to know exactly what this rule is, and they just won't accept your calling for it. You can just say like, well, okay, if you want to step away from the table and do your rules research, we're going to keep playing and have fun over here. You go find the rule, and when you're done, come back. And while you're gone, we're not going to kill your character or anything like that, but they're not going to really do anything. And I really like that. I think it incentivizes going with the flow, having fun, just being in the moment, not obsessing over the rules. It has all the right incentives there. And also it like means you have to step away from the fun to have loyalty to the rules, when really your loyalty should be to your friends and the table. So I'm going to start trying that out a bit. And then character knowledge is where they start to introduce the idea of metagaming, player meta knowledge, all that kind of stuff that you'll hear about as you go down the RPG YouTube rabbit hole, right? And when I was first getting into D&D, meta was this sort of like cardinal sin. It was this thing that was like, it's always bad. You want to keep as many things secret from your players as possible so they can't act on it. That is at least how I was kind of feeling like I was interpreting what was being said. Now, I feel like I'm starting to hear a little bit more, and the message that I want to share is meta is not always bad. And actually, as like a veteran player who's been, playing D&D for so long, I just kind of know a lot of the tropes and mechanics and things of anything, it feels like. Is it hard to be surprised by things? Maybe, but knowing meta information helps me make more informed decisions, and not ones that are to my benefit. Oftentimes I can make decisions that are to my detriment for comedic story effect or whatever, or to tell something more dramatic. Let's use the gelatinous cube as an example, because it's just a classic D&D monster that new players might not be able to guess that it's acidic or something like that. But anybody who's even remotely familiar with running D&D or their monsters is going to know, yeah, the gelatinous cube can melt a character that falls into them. As a veteran player, with that meta information, I kind of have two options. I can either, A, act on that information in such a way that I avoid taking any acid damage. I'm telling the other players to not get close. I'm outrunning the thing, right? I'm avoiding the danger. That is an option, but it's kind of lame. I think a more interesting and fun option is to lean into the unknown danger. You're the veteran player. You've probably lost characters before, so it's not the end of the world if you send your barbarian running in and you jump into the gelatinous cube to hack it up and you die, and you're able to show the other players how fun death can be in a moment of heroics, right? And at long last, we've reached the final page of Part 1, The Basics of D&D. They have a section here on antisocial behavior, which I would have liked to have seen placed before kind of almost at the beginning of this whole section of player etiquette, GM etiquette, X cards, all that kind of stuff. I think it's odd to have it at the end, because I feel like this is very, very important context to have. At least a lot of the points they make, like this one right here where they say, don't let players get away with being jerks to the other players using the excuse, that's what my character would do. That happens so often, or it seems to, maybe it's gone away a bit now, but that used to be a thing you heard about all the time, enough so it's in this damn book, right? Put this a little earlier in this section, right? I don't know why it's here at the very end, but I'm glad it's here. I'm glad that they're setting this precedent that you don't need to tolerate this kind of stuff. I had a game that I was starting where someone tried to rob their fellow party members' bags while they were fighting a manticore in the very first encounter, and I told them no. It's like, you can't do that. That's not the type of game we're running here, my guy.
You're not that guy, pal. Trust me. You're not that guy.
And then the other things that they point out, like, the game is not an economy, that the rules aren't intended to model something super realistic, and I think they're talking about gold pieces and things like that, because that's a common thing that gets brought up a lot on message boards, is like, the gold economy in this world doesn't make sense. It would break a small town's economy if the adventurers came through town. It's just like, shut up. Who cares? It's just fun. It's just a game. Like, that's an example of where I don't take the game too seriously, right? How does gold perfectly convert to silver, and how much of it is there in the town? Guess what? Nobody cares. Only you care. And also, guess what? You don't have to care. You can let that go. So, more good advice. I actually think this whole little section here is real good nuggets that GMs who can feel maybe like they need some sort. If you feel like your players are taking advantage of you, A, they're not your friends, and B, check out some of these tips here. Final section in part 1, the basics of D&D they include is the rules for the virtual table, which, I mean, the rules are the same for the game, right? But the kinds of things you're going to run into online is, how do you get music to play through everybody's headphones? I run my sessions on Discord for the video chats, and then I have a bot called, I think, Jockey Music, if you look that up. I don't know how Discord works. It kind of all just seems like programmer magic. I click a button, it adds a thing to Discord, and nothing's broken. So go check out Jockey Music. It will join your video calls and play music from Spotify. You can like link playlists and things, which is really great. Also, Owlbear Rodeo is my preferred favorite virtual tabletop. I'm not affiliated or anything with them, not sponsored. I just love it. It's cheap. It's like $5 a month or something, and I get way more than I need with storage space, and the interface is really easy to use, as opposed to something like Foundry VTT, which I quit. I spent money on it and immediately was like, well, that was a waste of money because it's way too complicated. So those are my recommendations. Oh, and one more thing for Virtual Table. I've already mentioned them before, but startplaying.games, right? Got to give another plug because I just think it's a good program, a good site, a good value. If you want to learn specifically 5e Dungeons and Dragons, they don't note it here, which makes sense, but they are partnered. Startplaying.games and Dungeons and Dragons are officially partnered right now. They have a survey on their site, or a little link you can click that will pair you up with a 5e Dungeon Master that will run you through a one-shot. You can learn all the basics. So if, who knows if that's still around when you're watching this video, but that's a great resource too. So what do we think? That's just chapter 1 of the Dungeons and Dragons 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide. I hope that you got everything that I wanted you to get out of this video. Value, some new insights, some tips and tricks you might not have heard before. This acts as a sort of review to see if you even want to get into the hobby or buy this book. Like I also said, I'm going to be going through all the other chapters. So if you weren't already, subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss that in the future. And if you want to support me, the Church of Doom, also my name's Landon, you can do so on Patreon. That's the best way to do it. For $3 a month, I am releasing things on there every other day, it kind of feels like sometimes. But at least like 2 to 3 times a week, I'm putting out some sort of new map asset, a set of card resources, like for Index Card RPG that I talked about earlier. You can build your dungeons out with them. I'm kit bashing minis, taking pictures of them and uploading them digitally so you can have physical digi minis. There's just so much on there that I want to offer you for a $3 tithing. So go check that out. Thanks. Love y'all.